everyone, and a warm welcome to today's ISTAT Learning Lab. My name is Peter Negline, and I'm a director of ISTAT, and I'm based in Singapore with BOC Aviation. And today we are delighted to be focusing on the global air cargo industry, which is one of the greatest sources of cash flow and profits for the airline industry since the onset of COVID. Our presenter today is Mr. Tom Crabtree, who is a regional director, I should say, of airline market analysis with the Boeing commercial airplanes in Seattle, and that's a position that Tom's held for 2 decades now, or more than 2 decades. Tom currently researches the air cargo industry, issues with specific responsibility for the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and the Commonwealth of Independent States, or the CIS. He is the primary author and the chief editor of the Boeing World Air Cargo Forecast, which is issued in every even-numbered year. So the last edition was out in 2020, and the next edition we hope will be out within the next 12 months. This year, Tom celebrates 30 years with the Boeing company. He has a degree in aerospace engineering and an MBA and a certificate in Russian from a Russian university. I won't name the city because I'll probably embarrass myself doing that. Before I hand things over to Tom, let me just outline some housekeeping matters. For those of you joining us live today, you can submit questions for Tom through the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll pose those questions at the end on a first-come, first-served basis, so please don't be shy in getting your questions submitted there. This event is being recorded for on-demand viewing at istat.org. So please recommend this to your friends, and we hope that they'll find it interesting. Tom's presentation will be loaded to the ISTAT website in the next day or so. We have a steady stream of content for you over the coming weeks, so please keep an eye on all of those as they're announced at istat.org. Again, please share the details of those events with your friends. So with that, let me hand it over to Tom for his insights on the global air cargo market. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Just a quick process check. Am I broadcasting the visuals adequately at this point in time?
Yes, that looks good to me.
Great. Okay, thank you, Peter. Good day, good morning, good afternoon to you all, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for having me. And for those of you who are regularly assaulted death by PowerPoint, I'll let you know that there are 37 visuals I will share with you, including this one, so you can count down to the bitter end. First off, I'd like to just stress that air freight, air cargo is a very different business in the air transportation system than passengers. It's very much centered around business relationships. It's very dependent in terms of handling at origin airport, destination airport. It's a door-to-door business. And unlike passengers, it's a very directional business. And pricing is often used as a mechanism to overcome directionality. It's a really difficult business to manage, especially for those folks who are only familiar with the passenger side of our business. At Boeing, we tend to break down the industry, and I'm just going to level set a few things at just a couple, 3 slides. Air cargo, we tend to group in 3 major categories: air freight, express, and mail. Air freight is the biggest component, around 78–80% of total air cargo. Express, small parcels and document traffic used by the big household names like FedEx, UPS, DHL, SF in China. We would also aggregate e-commerce, but there's a lot of gray areas and overlap in these different segments. So I'm sure some of you could probably come up with some exceptions to what I'm throwing out here, but by and large, these generalizations hold true. And until about 5–7 years ago, mail has always been a single-digit number in terms of total ton-kilometer traffic that we track in the air cargo industry, and it was falling for quite a long time, at least since I've been in this business for about a quarter century. And then about 2015, 2016, with the rise of e-commerce as we understand that force today, mail started to grow again. So keep that in mind as we go along in this discussion today. I want to dive a little deeper, though, very quickly into the differences between the express cargo industry and the general freight sector. About 80% of international air cargo traffic is general freight, big, ugly freight sold in what we call hundredweight shipments, usually heavier than 70 kilos, usually full pallet consolidations of sometimes a mix of commodities, sometimes homogeneous commodities. It is largely 90–95% controlled by the freight forwarders. These are aggregating agents who basically facilitate logistics movements on behalf of small, medium, and even sometimes large firms. And it's usually in general freight, it's a airport to airport business. Express, on the other hand, is about, in terms of the small parcel and document traffic that most lay people associate with the express sector, that's about 17% of total international traffic. And the household names I mentioned, they control everything from pickup at the shipper to the consignee. And but they also play in the general freight sector. So they cannot fill their aircraft solely with small parcel and document traffic. So if you ever have the good fortune to get a tour of an express operation, you'll board the airplane and you'll find that it's not just small parcel and document traffic. It's often a lot of general freight that is sold in the open market. That being said, there are roughly 2,100 jet freighters in the world, from roughly BA 146s all the way up to 747-8 freighters. And the express industry controls about 60% of that freighter fleet capacity at any given time, either directly or through chartered arrangements. Now, I want to emphasize the very importance of the air cargo industry by just going back to the notion that air cargo is a niche industry. And I say it's a niche industry. Less than 1% of world merchandise trade by tonnage is carried on airplanes, either packs, bellies, or freighters. And these are numbers that are coming to you live from the 2019 pre-COVID era. But 35% of the declared value of goods transiting international frontiers is conducted on aircraft. So it's a niche industry, but it's a very powerful niche industry. And it's also characterized by the fact that, contrary to what a number of pundits have said over the last, I'd say decade or so, freighters are essential to this industry, even in pre-COVID times. Folks, there are 26,000 jet transports out there, regional jets all the way up to big airplanes like the A380 and the 747. But only 8%, like 26,000, only 8%, about 2,000 airplanes at the end of 2019, that grew to 2,100 airplanes at the end of 2020, are jet freighter aircraft. Yet in 2019, 54% of ton kilometer traffic was conducted on freighter aircraft. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I just underline that it's a completely different business whose needs are only satiated by the specialists that I work with and the stakeholders I work with day in and day out in my working career. Now, the revenue that this industry generates is about 106 billion pre-COVID, year 2019, largely made up by the express carriers, the combination carriers, which are passenger airlines with expansive belly networks of wide-body passenger belly capacity, augmented with freighters. So think Lufthansa in Europe, Emirates in the Middle East, Qatar in the Middle East, Cathay in the Far East, for just a few handful of examples. Those two, the express carriers and the combination carriers, are the lion's share of revenue generators. All cargo non-express, you can see the logos there in the upper left-hand corner of the donut. Atlas, NCA, Airbridge, Cargolux are probably about 8 or 9% of that 11% that are all cargo non-express. And then passenger belly, which is a very North America historically phenomenon. United, American, Delta, historically Air Canada, although that's changing imminently, were passenger belly only. Japan Airlines for the past decade or so, Thai Airways since 2013 also are a couple of other examples of airlines that no longer operate freighters. They're only passenger belly only. Key thing here is that freighters are used in the generation of 90% of air cargo revenues in some form or another. That is a key point. Now, since 2019, we at Boeing have been mining Flight Radar 24 data with great alacrity, and it has really assisted us in understanding the capacity situation in terms of what's available to the air cargo industry. Now, for example, the numbers we're capturing in aircraft movements pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, which was about the 18-month period up to February, March of last year, 2020. In terms of capacity offered, the majority of capacity on offer was from wide-body passenger bellies, about 52%. Only about 48 were freighters in that bar chart at right. If you look, though, since the pandemic has unfolded. Consistently north of 70% of capacity on offer to the world air transportation sector has been from dedicated freighter aircraft. And only about 29% are wide-body passenger belly operations. And that includes, by the way, that 29% includes passenger freighter operations, Frachter. For those of you who speak German, and I apologize for my pronunciation, comprised are in that 29%. Process check, Peter, are we doing okay in terms of broadcast?
Yeah, everything's fine. Keep going. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So anyway, basically what this shows is that freighters have been working overtime since the pandemic unfolded in late first quarter of 2020. And they have basically anywhere been operating 20 to 30% harder than they were during pre-COVID times. Now, real quick, in a bit of a contrast to our good friends at IATA, who said that cargo traffic contracted initially around 10 or 11% last year, by the time the dust settled and we had all our data sources in a row, and there are a number of large freighter operators who do not share data with IATA in a timely manner, we found that air cargo traffic contracted 7% in year 2020 relative to 2019, and that was largely due to the takeout of wide-body passenger belly capacity, a deficit in excess of 20%, as you can see there, which led to, guess what, a spike in yields and a spike in revenue for those carriers that report through the IATA CargoIS data platform. Now, just updating through August, and I have preliminary numbers at my fingertips now for the month of September due to a number of airlines that have reported, like Cathay, Singapore, the Chinese carriers, and a handful of carriers who shared data directly with me pre-release of an IATA press release. We are seeing very strong numbers for the first 3 quarters of this year in air cargo. This chart just shows ton-kilometer traffic for which airlines earn revenue. So we use the term RTKs over the last 4 or 5 years. And 2017 was a good year. 2018 started out good but weakened. 2019, for those of you who are not familiar, was not a good year for air cargo, largely due to weakness in the industrial economy. About 60% of air cargo traffic by our calculations at Boeing is industrial movements. It's the movement of pieces, parts, work in process between different manufacturing facilities interregionally or intercontinentally. And it's often the movement of capital equipment used to make goods, specialty goods. And by case in point, somewhere between 10 and 15% of air cargo traffic is directly related to the production of cars, light or automobiles, and light trucks worldwide. And there was an acute slowdown in the the automotive industry in Q3 2018 that went through Q3, Q4 2020, or 2019, and that led to a distinct weakness in air cargo throughout 2019. Then the pandemic hit. Takeout of all that capacity led to an 18% contraction in Q2 2020, but it recovered very quickly, and year 2021 has been in the positive. If we take a look at it in terms of sheer ton-kilometer traffic, and again, this is both PAX belly and freighter traffic, year 2021 there in the magenta line is above the best year prior, which was year 2018, by far and away, especially since March. And you can see that we really haven't seen much of a lull in air cargo traffic that we normally see during the Northern Hemisphere spring and summer months. And we don't anticipate that weakening through the end of this year in any way, shape, or form. Just in case of a side note, you might notice that February is the weakest month of the year, and that is largely due to a great deal of the world's manufacturing workforce going on holiday during Lunar New Year, often referred to as Chinese New Year. And then a lot of Asian firms have the end of their fiscal year in March. So there is a big rush to get product back moving in March and into the hands of the consignee, so it becomes more of a positive on the balance sheet of said firms rather than a negative. So that's just an aside. But it's actually, one could argue that March is actually often busier than either September or October or early November in Northern Hemisphere peak season. If we take a look at the performance of this industry for the first 8 months of this year compared to the first 8 months of year 2020, It's a bit of like shooting a duck in a barrel. If you showed up for work, you're in positive territory. 23% up in traffic. Again, on a capacity recovery of about 13%, yields and revenues are in positive territory, and load factors are up. And if we take a quick glance at the first 8 months of this year versus the first 8 months of year 2019, again, we're still in positive territory on traffic, but not capacity, because there's a lot of missing in action, belly capacity out there. And yields and revenues are up almost 80%. It's staggering. And I want to do a little bit on load factors, because historically load factors are a bit nebulous, and this data point comes to us from IATA, and it's a bit of a theoretical conundrum on how you capture load factor and passenger bellies. Everybody's got an opinion, and everybody's generally wrong, but in my opinion. But I will emphasize that if we take a look at it strictly from freighters, freighters typically operate around 65 to 70% load factor. And those of you who are familiar with the passenger business know that for the last decade, 70 plus, 75 plus, over the last 5 years, in excess of 80% passenger load factors until the pandemic hit were pretty common. Freight, because it's directional, is really pretty much confined to a 65 to 70% average load factor. What this chart tells me is that load factors are in excess of probably 75, maybe even 80% at present, due to a number of factors, which I'll talk about at length in this sharing this of this deck today. If we take a look at the airlines and business models by region of domicile and by business model, just carving out two express carriers in particular, FedEx and UPS are in the purple bar at right, and their relative performance relative to the first 8 months of this year relative to the first 8 months of last year. Europe, Asia Pacific, Middle East carriers are all doing really, really well, primarily because of most of the strength that we're seeing in the air cargo industry today is tied to East Asia, North America trade, Transpac trade, or East Asia to and from Europe trade, and that it's a bit weaker, actually, East Asia to and from Europe than North America, simply because the North American economy has been a little bit more resilient than the European economy, generally speaking, since the onset of the pandemic. North America does not include the express carriers in any way, shape, or form. And I will admonish you that the rise of Amazon in North America and their domestic network is not captured in these statistics because the carriers that supply them with capacity do not report to IATA. What I do want to emphasize is look at Latin America and Africa. Largely speaking, the developing world has suffered much more acutely in air freight transportation services than the developed world. And case in point, I did a quick study of India earlier this year and discovered that Indian air trade contracted 32% in 2020 relative to 2019, whereas the industry numbers you saw earlier were roughly high single digits, like 7-8%. So it's a lopsided uptick. So just to emphasize that developed world markets have done better than developing world markets. And we're going to study that more earnestly at Boeing as the days in the coming weeks and months. If we take a look at by business model, the express carriers, all the business models, express carriers, all cargo carriers, the combination carriers, and the Pax belly only carriers are in positive territory for the first 8 months of this year. But if we take a comparative look at the first 8 months of 2 years ago, 2019, the express carriers, all cargo carriers in the driver's seat, the combination carriers are just now breaking even in terms of capacity, or I should say traffic growth. Pax belly only still down in excess of a third. So it's distinctly, it's a tale of two cities. One might compare it to that anyway. What will the recovery look like? Now, last month, our team, the market analysis team at Boeing Commercial Airplanes, released the Commercial Market Outlook 2021. We did not update the freight forecast, other than the freighter equipment forecast was adjusted slightly to compensate for some demand trends we've been seeing in conversion capacity of older passenger airplanes. But here's the key thing, the recovery. There's a lot of different speeds to this recovery. Domestic markets like the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, the United States, Canada, have actually weathered the storm much better than either regional markets, they're in the blue line, the dark regular blue line, or the turquoise line there in long haul. And in fact, we really don't see a recovery to 2019 passenger traffic, and this is solely focused on passenger traffic. We don't see a return to 2019 levels until the end of 2023, beginning of 2024. And why would I, as a cargo expert, worry about that? Well, we use that turquoise line as a proxy for the return of long-haul belly capacity, especially belly capacity tied to East Asia. We are now starting to study what's going to happen with the opening up of transatlantic airspace to passengers that are vaccinated between North America and Europe in the coming weeks or so. And that will probably have an impact on yields at some point to start putting pressure on them as capacity is restored. That being said, even in normal times, pre-COVID times, 40% of transatlantic 40% of transatlantic air trade is conducted on freighters, even with all that plentiful belly capacity on 767s, 787s, 777s, A330s, A350s. So it does point to the fact that even though there's plentiful capacity, there's still a sizable presence for freighters on the North Atlantic. Now, I will point out that we had a common theme a year ago when we released the Boeing World Air Cargo Forecast 2020 in late November of that year. Basically, we saw a perfect storm in the takeout of belly capacity and the heightened utilization of freighter capacity to compensate for that missing belly capacity. And then much of the world's white-collar workforce, which I'm guessing most of you are on this Learning Lab chat today, most of us were trapped at home. The shops were closed, and guess what? We started buying more stuff online, more than we did pre-COVID. And in fact, a number of players in the industry, the express carriers in particular, like FedEx, UPS, DHL, did say they saw an acceleration of e-commerce demand trends that they were not anticipating showing up until year 2023, 2024, 2025. And this chart gives you an idea of the relative gravitas of markets. The European Union, the US, China, $2.3 trillion market. So, and this information comes to us from Cargofax Consulting, where I'm good friends with the MD there, Frederick Horst, who is now based in Sydney, Australia. Now, I like to joke, Frederick is both a German and an Australian passport holder, and he has a thing against Americans. So for some reason, the lower 48 US states are missing on this graphic. I tried to correct it yesterday, thinking he had corrected it in his final version of the report, which he just published in October this month. And unfortunately, he still hasn't corrected it. But I'll be talking with him later this week about that. Point being, though, is that Frederick and his team have taken a really good look at how big e-commerce flows are intercontinentally and how much they comprise of major markets. So 15% of the Transpac market is e-commerce. 20% of intra-East Asia is e-commerce. East Asia to and from Europe, 16%, and even the North Atlantic at 12%. So somewhere around 15% in aggregate, maybe as much as 17% of world air cargo traffic is probably e-commerce flows based on the data that Cargofax has been able to compile to date. And I think this is a good segue for a lot of folks who really only understand air freight through the e-commerce prism, because there's a lot more to that industry, industrial support, business support, that is actually has a much longer longevity in the rise of jet transportation over the past 60 years than e-commerce. Quick process check, Peter, how are we doing?
Everything's good, Tom, no problem.
Thank you, sir. All right, so last month we released the updated forecast for our long-term growth for the air freight industry. In terms of cargo traffic, and again, this is cargo traffic both on PAX bellies and freighters, we see growth of around 4% through the year 2040, which represents a doubling of air cargo traffic levels through the next 20 years. And this is all based on the econometric parameters and the two left-hand panels you see on this particular visual. And the freighter fleet will expand in terms of number of units by 2.6% over the next 20 years. Now, where is all this growth going to come from? Well, in terms of ton-kilometer traffic, again, I want to emphasize this as both passenger belly carried traffic as well as freighter carried traffic. The world's biggest market, and will remain the biggest market, is the Trans-Pacific, that is East Asia to and from North America. And this chart is a gross simplification of the directionality of markets. We're just trying to get a quick snapshot of the world on a single visual. followed by East Asia, Europe, which is the world's second biggest market, and they will grow at the same growth rate there in magenta in aggregate, 4.4% over 20 years. Enter East Asia and Oceania, which is the world's current fourth largest market in terms of ton kilometer volume, will become the third, simply because of rising. Well, first off, a lot of the world's manufacturing is situated in East Asia. A lot of the world's aspiring middle class is in East Asia. And the third factor is if you are a shipper in, say, Singapore and you want to get a good to Hong Kong, your two modes of option are pretty much, especially if it's a higher value finished good, it's either air freight or container ship. Trucks aren't an option. Same for, say, Sydney to and from Singapore. Trucks aren't an option. So we see a rise in ton kilometer traffic into East Asia approaching 5% over the next 20 years. Generally speaking, the developed world markets, North America and Europe, tend to grow slower than developing world markets. And this is all based on, just to reemphasize, a long-term world economic growth rate of GDP at 2.7% through the year 2040. Now, why do we do all this studying of this in Seattle mostly? Well, it's to basically understand the long-term demand for aircraft. And in terms of freighters, there were 2,010 freighters in service at the end of 2019. I want to emphasize that CMO 2021 is still anchoring its base year on 2019 simply because anchoring it on year 2020 is a bit of a fool's errand given all the capacity that is artificially idled due to pandemic restrictions. Over the next 2 decades, we see only about 800 airplanes that are currently flying today will still be flying in 20 years hence. Consequently, you need that donut in there on the upper right-hand corner of the slide of 2,610 deliveries of either factory-built production machines or redeliveries of older passenger combi aircraft that are converted to freighter configuration permanently, redelivered to their next operator. To get to a greater than 70% growth in the world freighter fleet to 3,435 aircraft by the year 2040. And generally speaking, if you go to that donut there and start at the 12 o'clock position, moving up from what we call standard body freighters, anything that carries up to about 45 metric tons of useful load, that would include the 737 family of aircraft, 757, and recently the A321 P2F programs that are now unfolding. All 1,200 of those airplanes to be added will be conversions. When it comes to medium wide bodies, which is the battleground between the 767 freighter and the A330 freighter, 440 of those will be production freighters. There'll be about 520 conversions of wide bodies. Most of those will be medium wide bodies, and 450 new large wide body freighters will be produced by the world's manufacturers to satiate long-term demand. And I will emphasize, when it comes to available capacity and the importance of to the world air trade system, somewhere between 65 and 70% of available ton kilometers are generated by airplanes that carry more than 80 metric tons of useful load. Currently, that is the domain of the MD-11 freighter, 747s in all variants, and the 777 freighter. And there are 2 aspiring entrants. A number of 777 conversions are being offered to the market by no less than 3 P2F providers, as well as Airbus's stated intention to market an A350 freighter. So watch this space. There's going to be a lot of activity going on here in the next several months and years. And I want to emphasize just how that fleet has evolved. So this is, I'm an engineer by training, so you can never have a chart with too much information on it. So much to the chagrin of my colleagues in Seattle, I update the area sand chart, the upper right-hand corner, on a quarterly basis with monthly changes in the world large wide-body freighter fleet. And that fleet totaled about 300 in-service units back in year 2000. It reached about 640 or so aircraft in service by the end of September. What is truly amazing to me is that only about 48% of units in service today are actually in production with Boeing today. The rest are out of production. And believe it or not, roughly 15 747-200 classics survive. I dare say, though, most of those are in the Islamic Republic of Iran. There are a handful, though, there are not too many. But the lion's share are 747-400s, both production and conversions, and MD-11, both production and conversions, which will be requiring replacement. We anticipate that there's going to be a large replacement wave coming over the next 20 years. Now, I want to emphasize one thing about production versus conversions. So if you'll all humor me here, there's a number of folks that emphasize conversions as being the lowest capital cost, but what we have found is that over the last 21 years, looking at this chart, roughly 75 to 77% of the units added in this segment of the world freighter fleet, they have been production machines like 747-400 freighters. Those include the ERF freighters, about 40 of which we built, the 777 freighter, which we built since 2009, and the 747-8 freighter, which we've built since been delivering since 2011, and we'll finish production about this time next year. Only about 20-25% have been conversions, and that begs the question, why? About 20 years ago, I did a study comparing a like build 747-200 with GE engines built in 1979. It was a factory built freighter, and it had a sister ship with the same wing number and same engine combination that was built as a passenger airplane. Later, the passenger airplane of those two sister ships was converted to a freighter. And looking at the utilization, I found that the production freighter, even after 20 years plus years of service, was actually working 10 to 12% harder than its sister ship conversion. So consequently, yes, you get a lower capex nut with the conversion, but you get more work out of the production machine, and that's why production machines have been very popular in this particular segment. Now I'm going to shift gears completely now for something completely different, taking it back out. For those of you who might know me, I'm a bit of a plane spotter. We could say rabid to a degree, but I'm also, much to all of your chagrin, I'm also a container ship spotter. I want to emphasize that, again, air freight is a niche industry within air transport, but it's also a niche industry within freight transportation. Less than 1% of goods traded internationally are moved on aircraft, either packs, bellies, or freighters. That's the key message of that donut left. The bulk of merchandise trade worldwide are bulk commodities, pun intended. But only about 2 billion out of those 12 billion tons are container ship commodities. And that is the industry that I'm going to draw a lot of comparisons to, because in the world of higher value merchandise transportation, shippers either pick between air or container ship. And as a consequence, we at Boeing have put a lot of effort into understanding the container ship sector. And there's actually a good news story beyond the end of COVID for freighter aircraft demand. Now, there's some key trends I want to emphasize in that box boat sector. And box boats is basically shorthand for container ship, just FYI. So if I pivot between the two terms, you'll have to forgive me. Since the global financial crisis of 2009-2010, we've seen adroitly, acutely strengthened, heightened capacity discipline on the part of the world's container ship lines. The AP Moller Maersk, the MSCs, COSCOs, NYKs, Hapag Lloyds of the world. They have consolidated, they've bought up weaker or merged with weaker players, and they have obtained a pricing leverage that I'm going to show you that they probably will not let go of anytime soon. By the way, we all talk about e-commerce in the air transport sector, if it's totally an air cargo phenomenon. I got news for you folks, it isn't. A lot of e-commerce moves on container ships, especially for intercontinental movements for cross-border e-commerce. And then it goes to distribution centers where they are often distributed either interregionally like Europe or domestically like in the case of the US or Canada. And, ESG is a new term that we're all getting familiar with in every aspect of our global civilization since COVID unfolded last year. But starting in year 2017, 2018, the International Maritime Organization, which is the sister organization to the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal, IMO, is actually based in Oslo, Norway, promulgated a new set of rules in terms of fuel requirements that had to be more environmentally friendly. And believe it or not, container ships built just 4 or 5 years ago were not built to these new environmental standards. Bunker fuel that drives most of the world's container ship fleet at present is incredibly nasty stuff. It is just a little bit better than putting asphalt into the petrol tank of your automobile. It has a very high sulfur content, and there are a number of modernization efforts underway to make the world container ship fleet more environmentally friendly. And it's not a cheap or an easy endeavor, but it is driving a bit of fleet renewal at present, but not to the levels we've seen historically. So I'll dive into that momentarily. Current events. So, a year ago, April, our friends at the World Trade Organization said that world merchandise trade was going to collapse minimally 13% in year 2020 due to COVID. Their pessimistic case called for a contraction in merchandise trade of 32 to 33%. Got news for you, folks. It didn't happen. Container ship traffic only fell 1.4% year 2020 based on data shared with us from Clarkson Research Services in London. Well, due to COVID, we are seeing a number of shortages of container boxes. Most of those containers are built in China, and the industry there is working to correct that situation. Crews that man these vessels are often changing places in places like Singapore. They come from large English-speaking population centers in the developing world, like the Philippines or India, to name two examples. And when Delta reared its ugly head earlier this year, Singapore shut its borders to places like South Asia, which really made life difficult for getting crews to these boats. That has totally disrupted schedules. Port staff are often shorthanded, particularly in exporting economies like China. When there is an outbreak, these people can't go to work. And unlike those of us who work on computers, you cannot virtually load a container ship. It requires physical labor in presence. So basically, a lot of liner companies have really irritated the Jesus out of shippers, and blank sailings are often basically a shorthand for basically a false schedule. And so it's really just pandemonium out there. And so what's happened, there's a longer term story though behind all this. If we take a look at the container ship capacity that has entered the world fleet over the last 30 years in terms of 20-foot equivalent units or 6-meter long boxes, which is the world's standard form of measurement in the container ship sector. Ironically, it's 12-meter long or 40-foot long boxes that are the standard, but still the measurement is done at 20-foot level. And that is against the left-hand axis on this chart here. And you can see in the turquoise bar, the rise of container ship fleet capacity. The dark blue bar represents the backlog of container ships on order. And the black line represents the proportion of ships on order as a percentage of the existing fleet in service. That ratio hit about 61% in early year 2008. Since the global financial crisis, it has fallen until last November, when it reached about 8 or 9%. And it's now on a trajectory north of 20. It's actually, according to the data that I just received in the past week, it's now about 21%. Do I see it going back to that 60%? No. Simply because the container ship sector is consolidated, as I'm going to show you momentarily. They have pricing power, and they like it. In terms of the amount of box boat capacity that was on order at the end of August, and I do have September data now, I've just not had a chance to process it, but there's been really no dramatic change. There will be a spike in new capacity come 2023, and a lot of bookings are now stretching out into the world shipyards in 2024. But the key point here is in the text at right in the blue field. In the middle of that text, you'll see the CAGR fleet growth is averaging around 4.4 to 4.6% through year 2025, which is dramatically slower than the high single-digit, low double-digit growth we've seen over the last 30 years. And a lot of this is replacement capacity for environmental purposes. And I'm not capturing any of the scrapping or retirement rates that will come eventually due to heightened ESG scrutiny. So it is definitely, we're not going to see a significant uptick in capacity over the next 5 years. And when I joined this industry in the mid-1990s, the top 10 players had a total capacity market share in the container ship world of about 45, 47%. By the beginning of this century, it had reached 62%. And it kind of bounced around until the financial crisis. and then it started to grow. And by last year, it reached 87%. So we've seen, those of you might remember the name Hanjin. They went bankrupt in 2016. The big Japanese carriers, so NYK, MOL, Mitsui, they have all consolidated into one. It's called Ocean Network Express, and One is their name. So it is a really interesting time in terms of consolidation. And I have been trying to emphasize to air cargo audiences that we need to sit up and take note of this because of what's going to happen in terms of pricing longer term. Now, in the air cargo world in general, freight, we at Boeing are subscribers to the IATA Cargo IS data platform, which tracks in excess of 100,000 city pairs monthly in terms of actual pricing all in for air cargo transportation service. It's about 60% of the industry, so it's a fairly good sample size of the business. And you can see that basically, by and large, air freight yields have elevated since the onset of the pandemic, and they've been basically steady at elevated levels. So we're now seeing yields at $3.18 a kilo as of August, and that kind of represents near doubling relative to the nadir of air cargo yield pricing in third quarter of 2019 during that weak year of air cargo trade. What's happened in the container ship sector? Talk about a different story. We've seen largely strong yields maintained, not very much weak yields in the box boat sector. And this data comes to us courtesy of Drury Sea, an air freight shipper also based in London. And this is pricing for a 40-foot equivalent unit, an FEU, if you will, over the last 5 years. And by the third or fourth, or the last week of September, pricing reached about $10,400 per 40-foot unit. Pre-COVID, yields were south of $3,000, in fact, south of $2,000 all in for a transoceanic movement. A friend of mine who is an economist in the container ship sector and a much more expert in this field than I am, had a friend who was working with a major footwear manufacturer trying to get a box out of Ningbo on the coast of China to the San Pedro Bay ports, either LA or Long Beach, in August. It cost him $30,000 for the transit over the Pacific, whereas it was 10 times that less pre-COVID. And then moving it because of labor shortages in the developed world, particularly in trucking and in drayage and port handling, it cost that party another $3,000 to move it out of Southern California to a distribution center just outside of Chicago that same month. So freight transportation charges, newsflash, are really elevated. Now, if I take this chart and the previous one for air cargo and index them, this is a really stark story. Yes, container yields are up and air freight yields are up, but container ship yields are up a lot more. Now, we started to see a bit of weakening in the container ship sector, but it is not a collapse. Prices have come down to roughly $9,800 per 40-foot equivalent unit as of last week. What my teenage daughters would say, whoop-de-doo, it's not that big of a price break. So what is really interesting is what's going to happen long term. So just to remind you, near term, we've seen a lot of chaos in the world freight transportation sector due to equipment mismatches, labor shortages, what have you. But longer term, this is really important. Capacity discipline is going to remain supreme. Capacity growth will be slow for the middle part of this decade. Liner companies have consolidated and they've increased their pricing leverage. And guess what? The differential between container ship pricing and air freight has converged, and that makes air freight more attractive. So much so that when I joined this industry in the mid-90s, the rule of thumb was that air freight was 10 times more expensive than container shipping. By 2019, that multiple was roughly bouncing around between 12 and 16, as you can see on this chart. In the second quarter of last year, because of the onset of the pandemic, it shot up to nearly 30, but has receded every month since the middle of last year. And by August, air freight was only 3 times more expensive on a per kilo equivalent basis than container shipping. My thesis is to all of you today is this. The world has changed. And with many thanks to the CEO of the world's largest container ship company, AP Moller Maersk, based in Denmark, their CEO, Soren Sko, was quoted in The Economist just last month saying, the upshot is the container ship industry is going to remain cyclical, like all industries, but rates are going to normalize at a higher level. And COVID has reduced that price differential between air and container ship to all-time lows, and eventually both of those rates will fade. But my point is that much like oil prices, after the big oil price shocks of I'd say the 2005 to 2008 timeframe, prices remain sticky. And the signals have been, like this quote from Mr. Sko, indicate that that's going to change the calculus by which shippers make their modal decisions, either consciously or unconsciously. Shippers right now are desperate for what I call the 3 R's: redundancy, resiliency, and reliability. And they're not getting it out of the container ship sector. And basically, by default, we're going to see a heightened, longer-term use of air freight transportation. So to wrap up, if you take away nothing else from my session today, it's this: freighters and air cargo capacity going to remain high demand through the end of the COVID era due to missing belly capacity and the chaos in supply chains, particularly the container ship sector. And this is likely going to continue for the next 2 to 3 years. Developing world markets have fared worse than developed world markets. And watch this space. I'm going to dig more into this in coming presentations that I'll share with the industry. COVID has reduced the price between air and container ship pricing to all-time lows I never thought I would ever see in my career. And the macro trends in container shipping are going to likely lead to sustained higher pricing in that sector. And we think as a result of shippers seeking the 3 R's, air freight will benefit. And that's all I have.
That's fantastic, Tom. That's a tour de force. Really insightful. So thank you very much. For those still with us on this session, please submit your questions through that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get round to those in a moment. Tom, we have 2 questions already, so let's start with those, and then I have a couple of my own. This is from an anonymous attendee. It just says, how do you see Amazon competing with Fedex and UPS in the coming decade?
I would say at this point, we got to keep in mind what my friend Frederick Horst at Cargofax Consulting has labeled Amazon. It is an inventory management system. So, and I often pose a question to Boeing executives: is how much money is in it for the transportation provider when e-commerce shipping is free? So it's a real conundrum. The volumes are welcome, but how is the pricing for e-commerce factored in? Because basically Amazon is not selling their capacity in the open space. They are using it to move inventory between distribution centers here in the domestic US market, within the domestic Canadian market via Cargojet, which is an all-cargo airline based out of Mississauga, up in there in Ontario, and with ASL Group to a large degree within Europe. And then we have SF, which is also in China, a big e-commerce mover in that large and fast-growing e-commerce market. And cross-border e-commerce is kind of a free-for-all. It's a lot of mechanisms whereby block space agreements are used to move large consolidations. Does Amazon compete directly with FedEx or UPS? Right now, I'd say it's obliquely. Do they have the potential to start a retail product like FedEx, UPS, DHL? Yes. And that's something they've not shown their hand on yet. So watch this space.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Sunda, who's involved with ISTAT University. So we always welcome his participation. He asks, going forward, what percentage of cargo traffic would be on dedicated freighters versus converted freighters of the 60% which is not carried on in belly space?
Good question, which I don't have a ready-made answer. It depends on the gauge. Again, production freighters dominate at the large end of the scale for reliability and utilization purposes. I have one operator based in the Middle East I just visited about 3 weeks ago. They are getting 16 plus hours a day out of their 777 freighter fleet. It's just unbelievable. Can you do that with conversion? Theoretically, yes, but it's probably kind of a very Herculean task to achieve those utilization rates. And case in point is that a purpose point design freighter typically will work harder than a converted freighter. And that's why we see conversion capacity is so predominant in the standard body and the medium wide body sector, simply because if you look at the application of those machines, they're largely used in express carrier networks. They don't fly a lot. For example, 737 classic freighters, we're talking 3-4 hours a day. We're noticing that 737 800 BCF operators, those 50 plus or so that are redelivered and flying now, are hitting 5-6 hours a day. But that might also be a bit of pandemic effect in play there too. And there's also more payload range capability in those machines. But they tend to do 1 or 2 out and back sectors in a 24-hour cycle, 5, maybe 6 days a week, and then that's it. 767 freighters, we've noticed the same thing. 6-7 hours a day is a good utilization number. They're capable of more, but they're hub filling machines. Whereas it's the long haul machines that have really got to fly long transoceanic distances, 8, 10, 12 hours, and sometimes with a tech stop, and tech stops are cheaper than the lost revenue. So we see places like Anchorage or Dubai or Sharjah or Abu Dhabi being really busy for that express reason. So it's a tale of two cities. And for the breakdown of which is going to be more popular in production freighters versus conversion, it depends on the gauge. And my money is on production freighters in the large wide body sector.
Okay, excellent, thank you. The next question is from an anonymous attendee and asks, how will sustainability impact the continued use of, shall we say, older freighters? And if I can just add to that question, whether you can tell us a little bit about your view as to average lives of production freighters. What was it in the past, and how much do you think that may have been environmental issues affect that in the future?
Well, I'll go off what I've experienced in my career. I will say that yes, there'll be increasingly intense pressure on those operators of older equipment to replace with more efficient, more capable, and more environmentally friendly younger equipment. That's full stop. That's going to happen. But to answer your other point about what's the typical retirement age, it depends. And I hate to say it, but I've seen for large body freighter operations, particularly in the 4-7, in the studies just quick and dirty studies I've done, just extrapolating Syrian fleets. I got this question in July, and you can get about 30 plus years out of a 747-400 if you take care of it.
Sure.
And this is the other conundrum, and this is one of the tenets of the basis of the foundation of the Boeing World Air Cargo Forecast, and why we have not stridently increased the large wide body freighter fleet. 747 is a unique machine. You might see the picture over my left shoulder. I have a distinct bias towards that machine because I began my career on the 747-400 30 years ago. The nose door, if you know how to sell it in the general freight sector, is a moneymaker. Everything else competes on terms of capacity and unit cost and available ton kilometer cost. I get that. That machine allows you to compete on revenue, because when you pop the nose door, the yields go up by a 2-3x. So instead of $2 per kilo pre-COVID times, you're paying $4-6 a kilo. If it's longer than 6 meters, it has to go through the nose door. Those operators that have factory built, and there's about 260 or so nose built machines, 400 Dash 8s, and dare I say it, a couple of classics that were built long before my career started. We think they're going to be husbanded for the foreseeable future. They won't fly as much, but they'll be depreciated, and that nose door will be highly valued. And we don't see the retirement rates of those coming down. We actually see them extending, but more than likely the utilization rates of those machines will start to dwindle as younger large wide body freighter fleet types pick up the slack.
Right, but I suppose that's where the adoption or use of SAFs and all that will become much more important for some of those older machines, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. The next question is from Gerald, and he asks, aren't air freight yields at risk of declining as passenger belly capacity slowly returns?
Absolutely. Yeah. Everybody's planning for that eventuality.
But the revenue base will be higher, you think, after, even with that adjustment over the coming years?
I do. I think I'm firmly convinced that shippers are going to buy more air freight just to protect themselves from the chaos that has been the traumatizing experience of year 2021. It's just awful.
Right. Okay. The next question is, will Chinese domiciled cargo operators be a competitive threat to Middle Eastern-based cargo operators when it comes to carrying freight from China to Western Europe?
Well, that's a loaded one. I haven't given it much thought. I will say that in terms of equipment, China and the Middle East carriers have had a voracious appetite for freighter equipment. And we at Boeing have been working that sector for as long as I've been in this business. Keep in mind that there are only about, I think, 14 large wide-body freighters domiciled in the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong in 1999. And guess what? Most of those were with Cathay,
Yes.
And then Air China. And now there's in excess of 60. The Middle East carriers, there were very few. Saudi had, I think, 3 747-200s 30 years ago. And now we have tour de force and those folks, as well as Emirates, Qatar, and Etihad. And the edge, dare I say it, will go to probably the Middle East carriers. Why? So air cargo, as I pointed out in that first slide, is a totally different industry. It's based on relationships. The Middle East carriers are very keen on bringing in expats, particularly out of Western Europe, but not exclusively. A number of East Asian expats also work at the Middle East carriers. And guess what? Freight transportation providers tend to work with people they know, because they know who to pick up the phone and call when things go sideways, and they do go sideways.
Sure, I understand. The last question we have from the audience is, do you, and this may not be your specialty directly, but do you know of any companies utilizing regional aircraft as freighters?
Yes, a handful. They tend to operate on a contract basis in support of the express carriers. So typically they sell their capacity at ad hoc emergency relief, automotive industry support. Let me pick on one carrier in particular in Mexico as Aeronavis TSM. They have a number of smaller RJ type aircraft. They're now getting into 737 classic freighter capacity, 737-300s in particular. They are working with a non-Boeing PDF conversion provider, that's AEI, for that capacity. So, but typically by and large, RJs don't have the unit cost that makes sense for especially general freight. They will for the express sector, but then when you start to deal with the segments they're getting into, it's, let's say, 500 kilometers, 800 kilometers that you're two different points you're bridging. You're competing with trucks in contiguous land markets. And we have a saying in cargo at Boeing, all freight begins and ends on a truck. That's why we work really hard when we design a freighter airplane to make sure that it interlines really well, not only with other airplanes, but also with the trucking industry.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. Well, look, that's all the questions we have from the audience. Two from me. There's been a lot of announcements over recent weeks and months, shall we say, on the conversion of different gauge aircraft. Are you, or that run rate of announcements, do you think is that within expectations, or is that above expectations? Are you worried that that conversion market may, there may be too many converted aircraft down the road?
I will say, yeah, it's above expectations for us. We have adjusted our freighter fleet equipment forecast from the World Air Cargo forecast that we published last November, 11 months ago, to the commercial market outlook we just released last month. And we captured that conversion demand in the standard body sector and the medium wide body sector.
Right.
The large wide body sector, we've seen the emergence of 3 players in that regard. So Fedex, which is the furthest along in terms of 777-300ER PDF conversion capacity. They just announced this morning, today, in the last 24-hour cycle, that they showed pictures on a media outlet that they're cutting the new door in. Good for them. Good for them. Then we have Mammoth, which is targeting 777-200LR passenger capacity initially, but will eventually target 777-300ER PDF conversion capacity. And then there is an entity called Sequoia K-Mod. It's got BlackRock Aviation involved. I'm from Kansas. I'm originally. I'm keenly watching what will happen there in Wichita. But they are probably the furthest behind in terms of bringing their conversion to market. But they're all three in there, and they've committed resources, capital, and otherwise to developing these three modifications. So I suffice it to say there'll be winners and losers. We just don't know who they're going to be yet.
No, I understand those programs are a bit early, but it's going to be interesting to watch how many of those passenger aircraft are converted. And this is probably a big open-ended question, so I don't expect you to answer it all, everything, but I'm just thinking that the industry, as you've alluded to, has become so profitable. The revenues are very strong. The profit growth has been significant. And it's a turnaround from some of the performances we've seen over the last decade. As you've highlighted, there were some years where obviously the average player was loss-making and so forth. How do you think this really strong cash flow, really strong revenues, strong profits and so forth have changed behavior amongst the major freight players?
Anecdotally, I've heard that they're building up their war chest for when yields start to go back to normal levels. Because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when we'll see a slowdown in freight transportation in some form or another. I will say, though, the war chest on the part of the air cargo carriers, and I think, I've heard ballpark numbers, and one of our audience members is actually working with me today on updating our revenue tally for last year in terms of air cargo, and I hope she's still listening, but it's really interesting because the container ship sector, according to Drury. Okay, you saw that slide for me earlier, Peter. Air cargo pulled in $106 billion revenue in 2019. I think IATA or some other industry pundits have said it probably reached 150, 60 billion. We're still working on that at Boeing. Give us a little bit of time for what happened last year in the air cargo sector. The container ship sector, in terms of the numbers I just cited for air cargo were revenue, because profitability is a bit dicey trying to capture that from combination carriers, as they don't break that out, generally speaking, between passenger ops and cargo ops. On the other hand, the container ship sector, their profits for this year are expected at 150 billion, according to Drury. Next year, at 155 billion. And these are statistics Drury just released last week. And I just kind of sat there stupefied like this while watching that presentation through my computer screen. And I know the principle involved. So even if that prognostication only becomes half, 3/4 true, they're sitting on a bigger war chest of money. And that begged the question in my mind, well, maybe they're going to buy more container ships, right? But far from it. They're just buying back shares and paying down debt, and or provisioning for modifying their existing fleet that is relatively young to meet ESG requirements going forward, just to maintain capacity discipline.
I heard somebody in the industry say that, look, for the shipping, sea freight guys, they're making a lot more money than they have in the past, as you've alluded to. Why change it? Why change anything? Yeah, there are all these problems across the system, but we're making more money. So what's the problem? All right, Tom, look, we have no further questions from the audience. I'm really, really delighted with your presentation and your insights today. So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate that. For those in our audience, please join us in a week's time. We have Mr. Bert Van Leeuwen from MUFG, who's on the 2nd of November going to present his views on the outlook for the industry, or both for 2021 as well as the outlook for 2022. So we hope you can join us for that. Again, Tom, thank you very much, and we'll stay in touch. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Zach. Thanks, Crystal. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone.